We didn't want the galaxy's wars. When we breached the stars, we found them burning. Empires clashing in petty endless slaughter over dust and pride. So humanity stepped back. We became the medics, the peacekeepers, the quiet sanctuary in a screaming void. For 200 years, the galaxy thought our neutrality was born of weakness. They thought we lacked the stomach for violence. They were wrong. We weren't hiding out of fear. We were holding ourselves back. The smell of the medbay was always the same, no matter the sector, no matter the species. It was a suffocating mix of sterilized ozone-synthesized painkillers and the sharp, coppery tang of fresh blood. Dr. Sarah Jenkins stood over a diagnostic table, her gloved hands slick with the dark, viscous fluid of a dying Aurelian soldier. The alien's chest heaved in ragged, uneven spasms. 4 of its 6 eyes were clouded with shock. "Pressure is dropping," Jenkins said. Her voice was flat, exhausted. She had been awake for 26 hours. "Clamp that ruptured artery. If he bleeds out on my table, I'm making you clean the filters, David." First Officer David Cole didn't smile at the joke. He just leaned in, fingers manipulating a microcauterizer with practiced precision. The hiss of burning tissue filled the small space, followed by a putrid curl of smoke. "Got it. Vitals are stabilizing. Barely." Jenkins stepped back, peeling off her surgical gloves. They snapped loudly in the quiet hum of the room. She tossed them into the incinerator chute and ran a hand over her face, leaving a faint streak of alien blood across her cheekbone. "That's 20 today," she muttered, staring at the unconscious Aurelian. "And the Varakari cruisers are still shelling the surface. It's like trying to empty an ocean with a slotted spoon." Above them, on the bridge of the United Nations medical frigate Nightingale, Captain Arthur Hayes watched the ocean boil. The Nightingale hung in high orbit over Aegis Prime, a contested dirt ball of a planet that possessed nothing of value except its strategic location. That was enough to make it a slaughterhouse. Through the main viewport, Hayes watched the orbital bombardment. Varakari dreadnoughts, sleek and jagged like obsidian knives, drifted in the void, casually dropping kinetic rods into the atmosphere. Every few seconds, a brief, silent flash of orange light would bloom on the night side of the planet. Another city gone. Another 100,000 lives erased. Hayes crossed his arms over his chest. He was a man made of hard angles and quiet regrets. His uniform was immaculate, a stark white, starkly contrasting the violence outside his window. The white was intentional. The glowing red cross painted on the hull of the Nightingale was intentional. "Captain," Cole's voice crackled through the bridge comms, "we've got 3 more dropships approaching. Civilian transports. They're venting atmosphere and squawking the Sol Concordat code." "Let them in," Hayes replied instantly. "Reroute power from the secondary drives to life support. We need to keep the air breathable in the cargo bays." "Sir, we're at 140% capacity," Cole warned. "If we pack any more refugees in there, they'll be sleeping on top of each other." "Then they'll be warm," Hayes said, his tone brokering no argument. "Open the bay doors." Humanity had played this game for 2 centuries. When we first discovered the hyperlanes, we expected to find enlightened civilizations, a grand federation of stars. Instead, we found a galaxy locked in a perpetual grinding war. The Varakari Empire, the Aurelian Ascendancy, the Keltesh swarms, they were all the same. Brutal expansionist and utterly indifferent to collateral damage. Earth's governments took one look at the meat grinder and opted out. We declared the Sol system a neutral zone. We built our fleets not to conquer, but to heal. Human ships became the only safe havens in a burning galaxy. The warring empires tolerated us because we treated their wounded too. We were the galaxy's janitors, sweeping up the shattered pieces of their pride. "Proximity alert," the navigation officer called out. The tension on the bridge spiked. A Varakari cruiser detached from the bombardment formation and angled its massive prow toward the Nightingale. It dwarfed the human vessel, a shark circling a life raft. Incoming transmission from the Varakari vessel. Cole reported, having just stepped onto the bridge from the medbay. Audio only. Put it through. A harsh, clicking dialect hissed through the speakers, instantly translated by the ship's AI into cold, synthetic English. Human vessel, you are harboring Aurelian combatants. Surrender them immediately. They are enemies of the Empire. Hayes didn't blink. He stepped closer to the comms receiver. Varakari cruiser, this is Captain Arthur Hayes of the UNN Nightingale. We are a neutral medical vessel operating under the Sol Concordat. We harbor no combatants. We treat the wounded regardless of species. If you have injured soldiers, send them. If not, clear my approach vectors. I have dying people trying to dock. Silence hung over the channel. The Varakari were calculating. They didn't respect human morality. They respected the utility of having human doctors sew their commanders back together when the fighting was done. The Empire notes your defiance human. One day, your white paint will not protect you. The transmission cut out. The cruiser sluggishly turned away, rejoining the orbital bombardment. Hayes let out a slow breath. He hated this. He hated standing by while billions burned, protected by nothing but a flimsy treaty and the enemy's convenience. But it saved lives. Every refugee in the cargo bay was a soul pulled from the fire. We pushed our luck today, Cole said quietly, standing beside Hayes. Luck is the only currency we have left, Hayes replied, his eyes fixed on the burning planet below. Let's just get these people patched up and jump back to the Sanctuary Station. I've had enough of Aegis Prime. Sanctuary Station was humanity's masterwork, a colossal spinning ring of metal and glass anchored in the deep space between the warring territories. It wasn't a fortress. It was a hospital, a refugee camp, a city of the displaced. Over 1 million souls lived aboard Sanctuary. Most were aliens, whose homeworlds had been turned to glass. They lived in the vast hydroponic parks, breathing human-filtered air, eating human-grown protein. It was chaotic, loud, and incredibly fragile. The Nightingale docked smoothly at Pier 4. The moment the airlocks engaged, the chaos began. Medics rushed stretchers down the gantry, shouting orders over the roar of station machinery. Jenkins was in the thick of it, her white coat, stained brown directing triage teams with the ruthless efficiency of a battlefield general. Hayes stood at the observation deck, a cup of synthetic coffee warming his hands. He watched the unending stream of misery flow from his ship into the station. Good haul this time, a voice said behind him. Hayes glanced over his shoulder. Station Director Gregory Miller walked up, leaning heavily on a cane. Miller was an old UN bureaucrat, a man who traded in logistics and compromises. 4,000 refugees, Hayes said, turning back to the window. A drop in the bucket. The Varakari are glassing Aegis Prime. The whole sector is going to collapse. We can take another 100,000 if we stack the habitation blocks, Miller said, rubbing his temple. But the UN is getting nervous. The Varakari are making pushes closer to the Sol border. They're claiming we're artificially prolonging the war by saving Aurelian citizens. They're civilians, Greg. They aren't prolonging anything except their own miserable existence. I know that. You know that. But the Varakari High Command only sees numbers, and right now, we are a variable they don't like. A sudden high-pitched whine echoed through the observation deck. It wasn't a sound from the station. It was a frequency bleeding through the emergency comms channels, setting Hayes's teeth on edge. Then the station alarms triggered. Red light bathed the concourse below. The blare of the klaxons was deafening. Hayes dropped his coffee, its shattered brown liquid pooling on the pristine floor. "What's happening?" Miller shouted over the noise. Hayes was already sprinting for the nearest comms terminal. He punched in his override codes. The screen flickered to life, showing the tactical readouts from the station's rudimentary sensor grid. 3 slip-space ruptures had just opened dangerously close to the station. "Varakari," Hayes whispered, the blood draining from his face. 3 heavy dreadnoughts. They bypassed the border checkpoints. "Why?" Miller asked, panicked. "We're a neutral station. We treat their wounded. Not anymore," Hayes said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He tapped the screen, bringing up the visual feed from the exterior cameras. The 3 Varakari warships hung in the void, their weapons arrays already glowing with built-up plasma. They weren't transmitting. They weren't demanding surrender. They were firing. The first volley of plasma torpedoes struck the habitation ring. There was no sound in space, but Hayes felt the impact through the deck plates. The vibration traveled up his legs into his chest. A massive section of the station's outer hull simply vanished, vaporized in a blinding flash of blue-white heat. "Atmospheric breach in sectors 4 through 9. The station AI announced, its pleasant voice completely at odds with the slaughter. Evacuation protocols initiated. Down on the concourse, panic erupted. The refugees Hayes had just brought aboard screamed as emergency bulkheads began to slam down, sealing off the damaged sections. "Get on the horn," Hayes roared at Miller. "Broadcast the concordate codes. Tell them who we are." "They know who we are," Miller yelled back, typing frantically at his console. "They're jamming us, Arthur. They're targeting the life support pylons." Another silent flash on the visual feed. A kinetic rod moving at a fraction of light speed punched clean through the central hub of Sanctuary Station. It shattered the massive spinning spoke that kept the artificial gravity stable. The station groaned, a terrible deep sound of tearing metal. Gravity failed instantly. Down on the concourse, stretchers, medical supplies, and screaming people drifted up into the air. Hayes grabbed the bulkhead to steady himself. "Cole Jenkins!" he shouted into his personal comms. "Static. Captain, hull breach on the Nightingale." Cole's voice was broken, barely audible. "Pier 4 is gone. We're venting. Get to the escape pods, David. That's an order." There was no reply. Hayes stared at the screen. The Varakari dreadnoughts weren't rushing. They were taking their time, methodically dismantling the station. They were targeting the evacuation bays, systematically destroying the escape pods before they could even launch. This wasn't a military objective. This was an execution, a message. Neutrality is complicity. A final massive barrage of plasma struck the reactor core of Sanctuary Station. "Director, we need to leave." "Now," Hayes said, turning to Miller. But Miller wasn't moving. A piece of shrapnel from the overhead ventilation grate had ruptured the glass behind him. The old man was staring at his chest, where a jagged piece of metal protruded. He fell backward, floating weightlessly in the zero-gravity blood, trailing from his wound like a crimson ribbon. Hayes didn't scream. He didn't cry. He felt something break inside him. Something fundamental. It was the dam that had held back 200 years of human restraint. He pulled himself along the wall, ignoring the groaning metal of the collapsing station, making his way to the only surviving shuttle bay in his sector. He watched out the viewport as pieces of the Nightingale drifted by. A white hull painted with a red cross, scorched black and tumbling in the dark. 14,000 people were on this station. Human medics, alien children, pacifists, all burning. Hayes punched the manual release on the shuttle airlock. As the small craft shot away from the dying station, he looked back one last time. The Varakari dreadnoughts were turning away, their work complete. They left the debris field behind, arrogant, untouchable. They believed they had just taught the weak, bleeding heart humans a lesson about the realities of the galaxy. Arthur Hayes sat in the pilot's seat of the lone shuttle, watching the coordinates for Earth tick down on the navigation computer. His hands weren't shaking. His mind was startlingly clear. They hadn't taught humanity a lesson. They had just freed them from their own rules. Earth was quiet. It was always quiet in the halls of the United Nations Defense Council in Geneva. The room was a relic, an amphitheater of polished mahogany and blue upholstery. For 2 centuries it had been a place of administrative tedium. Discussions about agricultural output, hyperlane toll regulations, and medical supply chains. Today the silence was heavy, suffocating. Admiral Thomas Reed stood at the center of the podium. He wasn't in the ceremonial whites worn by the medical fleets. He wore a uniform of dark slate grey, the uniform of the Seoul Defense Initiative, a branch of the government so profoundly defunded and ignored that most citizens forgot it existed. Reed was an old man, his face a map of deep lines, his eyes hard and uncompromising. Behind him, a massive holographic display hung in the air. It looped the final telemetry data from Sanctuary Station, the blue flashes, the tearing metal, the silence. 14,281 casualties, Reed said. His voice echoed off the wood-paneled walls. It wasn't a speech. It was a reading of the dead. 3,000 of them were human citizens, medics, engineers, volunteers. He let the number hang in the air. Captain Arthur Hayes survived. He provided the sensor logs. The strike was deliberate. The Varakari High Command has issued a public statement to the Galactic Net. They claim Sanctuary Station was a legitimate military target harboring Aurelian assets. They state that human neutrality is officially revoked. A murmur ran through the assembled delegates. It wasn't panic. It was a cold, creeping realization. The delegate from the North American coalition stood up. She looked sick. Admiral, our medical fleets are unarmed. Our supply lines are exposed. If the Varakari have declared us hostile, we are defenseless. Reed looked at her. He didn't smile, but a grim satisfaction flashed in his eyes. With respect, Counselor, you are mistaken. He tapped a key on his podium. The hologram shifted. The loop of the burning station vanished, replaced by a star map of the Sol system. 200 years ago, when we enacted the neutrality doctrine, we made a choice to be the healers of the galaxy. Reed said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the weight of a secret kept for generations. We chose not to wage war, but we are not fools. We looked at the galaxy. We saw the butchers and the tyrants, and we knew that eventually a day would come when someone would mistake our compassion for weakness. The map zoomed in on the Kuiper Belt, the vast ring of icy bodies at the edge of the solar system. We did not dismantle our military-industrial complex, counselors. We simply hid it. Reed tapped another command. On the hologram, the icy surface of an asteroid, designated Ceres Alpha, cracked open. Massive, heavily armored doors slid apart in the vacuum of space. From the dark interior of the rock, a shape emerged. It was not painted white. It did not carry a red cross. It was a dreadnought. But it was completely unlike the sleek predator designs of the Varakari or the elegant curved ships of the Aurelians. It was a brutally utilitarian slab of grey armor, plating bristling with kinetic rail batteries, point defense lasers, and massive blocky engine housings. It looked less like a ship and more like an anvil. The UNS Retribution, Reed said quietly. Class 5 Titan. And she is not alone. The hologram expanded. Across the Kuiper Belt, across the moons of Jupiter, and the rings of Saturn, hidden dry docks were opening. Hundreds of red icons bloomed on the display. Cruisers, destroyers, carrier groups. A phantom fleet built in secret, maintained by generations of skeleton crews, sworn to silence. They had spent 2 centuries optimizing armor alloys, perfecting slip-space targeting algorithms, and designing weapons meant to break empires. The delegates stared in stunned silence. The sheer scale of it was impossible. "We didn't build these to conquer," Reed continued. "We built them to ensure that if someone ever broke the Concordat, we could finish the fight. Unilaterally. Devastatingly." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the men and women who held the fate of humanity in their hands. "The Varakari Empire believes they have destroyed our spirit by burning our hospital," Reed said. "They believe we will cower. I require the Council's authorization to deploy the home fleet." The delegate from the European Union stood up. He was an older man who had spent his life negotiating peace treaties. His voice shook slightly, not from fear, but from a profound, terrifying sorrow. "Admiral Reed, if we authorize this, we cannot unring the bell. The galaxy will never see us as healers again." "No, they won't," Reed agreed. "But they will never target a Red Cross again." The vote took less than 3 minutes. It was unanimous. There was no cheering, no jingoistic speeches about human supremacy, only a grim industrial determination. The healers were clocking out. The executioners were clocking in. 48 hours later, Arthur Hayes sat in the observation deck of the UNS Retribution. He still wore his white uniform, though it was stained and rumpled. He felt out of place among the heavily armored Marines and the sterile, militaristic efficiency of the warship. Admiral Reed approached him, holding 2 cups of black coffee. He handed one to Hayes. "We're crossing the border in 5 minutes, Arthur," Reed said. "Where are we hitting?" Hayes asked, staring out at the void. "The Varakari shipyards at Tarsus. It's where the fleet that hit Sanctuary was built. We're going to dismantle their infrastructure." Hayes took a sip of the coffee. It was bitter real and grounded him in the moment. He thought of David Cole. He thought of Sarah Jenkins. He thought of the thousands of people who burned because a warlord wanted to send a message. Admiral Hayes said softly, "The Varakari, they fight by their own rules. They don't take prisoners. They target civilians. They fight dirty." Reed looked at the former medical captain. The old admiral's face was carved from granite. "Arthur," Reed said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "They don't know what dirty is. They've been fighting other children in a sandbox. We're going to show them how humans wage war." The ship shuddered violently as the massive hyperdrive spooled up. Outside the viewport, the stars stretched into long, blinding lines of light. The sleeping giant hadn't just woken up. It was angry. Tarsus was a monument to Varakari vanity. A colossal orbital foundry encircling a gas giant, it birthed the Empire's dreadnoughts in an unending stream of industrial supremacy. It was protected by a defense grid of orbital plasma cannons and a garrison of 40 warships. The Varakari considered it impenetrable. They believed the gravity well of the gas giant would force any attacking fleet to drop out of slip space millions of miles away, giving the defenders hours to prepare. They were expecting a conventional war. They were expecting the civilized rules of engagement they had enjoyed for centuries. Humanity didn't do polite, and we certainly didn't care about the rules anymore. The transition from slip space is violently disruptive. Standard galactic protocol mandates exiting a jump at the absolute edge of a system to avoid the displacement wave, a devastating ripple of kinetic energy caused by real space reasserting itself. Admiral Reed ordered the home fleet to exit directly inside the Tarsus orbital ring. The UNS Retribution tore a hole in the fabric of space less than 500 kilometers from the central forge. It didn't arrive gracefully. It slammed into reality, dragging 80 cruisers and destroyers behind it. The resulting displacement wave hit the Varakari shipyards like a physical wall. Before a single shot was fired, the raw physics of the human arrival shattered the delicate sensor arrays and communication pylons of the enemy defense grid. Smaller dry docks buckled and snapped. Unfinished dreadnoughts were torn from their moorings, spinning wildly out of control and crashing into each other. On the bridge of the Retribution, the lighting snapped from standard blue to combat red. "Target locks confirmed across the board," the weapons officer called out. His voice was steady, bored even. It was the voice of a man who had drilled for this exact moment for 20 years and was finally being let off the leash. "Fire for effect," Reed ordered. The alien empires fought with light and heat. Plasma torpedoes, hard light lasers, thermal lances. They were elegant weapons meant to overwhelm energy shields and melt armor. Humans fought with mass. The Retribution shuddered as its main battery fired. There was no bright flash of laser light, just the brutal mechanical recoil of magnetic rails accelerating a 3-ton slug of depleted uranium to a fraction of the speed of light. The Varakari relied on energy shields designed to disperse thermal blooms. They were entirely useless against solid matter, moving at relativistic speeds. The human slug struck the lead Varakari flagship dead center. It didn't explode. It didn't burn. It just punched. The kinetic energy transfer was so absolute that the alien warship simply ceased to exist in any recognizable form. The armor shattered, the internal bulkheads collapsed, and the sheer friction of the impact flash vaporized the atmosphere inside the ship. A vessel that took 10 years to build was reduced to an expanding cloud of superheated shrapnel in exactly 2 seconds. Hayes stood on the observation deck, watching the slaughter through the polarized glass. He gripped the safety rail until his knuckles turned white. "First volley away." The bridge comms relayed. Across the void, the human fleet unleashed a barrage of solid slugs, cluster munitions, and tactical nuclear torpedoes. The sky burned. It wasn't a battle, it was an industrial demolition. The Varakari garrison tried to return fire, but their targeting sensors were blinded by the dirty radiation-heavy interference of human nuclear detonations. When their plasma fire did hit the human ships, it splashed uselessly against the Retribution's armor. Humanity hadn't wasted time developing complex, power-hungry energy shields. We had just bolted 12 feet of ablative tungsten carbide plating to our hulls and called it a day. "Admiral, enemy orbital batteries are spinning up," a tactical officer warned. "Ignore them," Reed replied. "Focus fire on the primary habitation ring of the shipyard. Break the structural spine." Hayes turned away from the glass, staring at Reed. "Admiral, the habitation ring. There are 100,000 civilian workers in there." Reed didn't look at him. His eyes remained fixed on the tactical display. "I know, Arthur. We're targeting civilians," Hayes's voice cracked. 2 days ago, he was running triage on Aegis Prime. He had sworn an oath to preserve life. "They targeted a hospital," Reed said, quietly, the heavy silence of the bridge making the word sound like a physical blow. "They targeted medics and refugees to send a message. The time for moral superiority ended when Sanctuary Station burned." Reed turned to face Hayes. The old man looked exhausted, carrying a weight that was rapidly crushing him. "If we hit their military, they will rebuild. If we hit their workers, their engineers, the people who design the guns that kill our people, the machine stops. We are not here to win a war, Arthur. We are here to dismantle their capacity to wage one." Out the viewport, the Retribution's secondary batteries tracked toward the massive spinning ring of the shipyard. "Fire!" Reed said. Hayes closed his eyes. He didn't want to watch. He felt the ship vibrate. He knew the math. He knew exactly what explosive decompression looked like. He knew the lungs ruptured in seconds, the blood boiled in the vacuum. He had spent his entire life trying to stop those things from happening. When he opened his eyes, the habitation ring was gone. just a jagged spinning halo of debris drifting into the gravity well of the gas giant. "Shipyard is neutralized," the tactical officer reported. "No active Varakari signatures remain." "Recall the fleet," Reed ordered. "Spool up the drives. We jump in 3 minutes." It had taken the Varakari 3 hours to destroy Sanctuary Station. It took the home fleet exactly 14 minutes to erase Tarsus from the galactic map. The silence that followed the fall of Tarsus was louder than the bombardment itself. Galactic communication networks, usually buzzing with trade requests, diplomatic posturing, and propaganda ground to a dead halt. The footage of the Tarsus strike, recorded by the single automated deep space buoy the humans had intentionally left intact, played on an endless loop across 1,000 worlds. There were no human ultimatums broadcast, no demands for surrender, no grand speeches about vengeance. Humanity just vanished back into slip space, leaving a graveyard of twisted metal and frozen bodies in their wake. For 2 days, the UNS Retribution sat completely dark in an uninhabited nebula, running silent and deep. The crew worked with a quiet, terrifying efficiency. There was no celebration in the mess halls, no cheering, just the grim checking of weapon systems and the loading of fresh munitions. In the cramped confines of the tactical center, Admiral Reed sat at a holographic table sorting through intercepted galactic comms. Hayes stood across from him, sipping heavily synthesized rations. He had traded his white medical uniform for standard fleet gray. It felt heavy. It felt like giving up. "The Aurelian ascendancy is broadcasting on all human frequencies," Reed noted, tapping a blinking blue icon on the table. "They want to form a coalition. They think because we hit the Varakari, we are their allies. They are offering us access to their supply lines and safe harbor in their core worlds." "Are you going to answer them?" Hayes asked. "No," Reed said, dismissing the icon with a swipe of his hand. "We aren't here to play sides in their petty border disputes. The Aurelians glassed 3 human colonies 80 years ago during the Orion skirmishes. We haven't forgotten. They are just as guilty of this endless slaughter as the Varakari. So we stand alone. We have always stood alone, Arthur. The only difference now is that we aren't pretending otherwise." Reed pulled up a schematic of the galactic hyperlanes. Red lines pulsed angrily on the map, converging on a single choke point. "The Varakari High Command has panicked," Reed explained. "They are pulling their 7th Fleet off the Aurelian front. 400 ships. They are moving them to intercept us before we can hit their core sectors." Hayes studied the map. His medical training kicked in, analyzing the flow of the enemy fleet the same way he would analyze the spread of a pathogen through a host's bloodstream. "They're moving too fast," Hayes murmured, tracing the red lines. "If they pull their entire 7th Fleet, they leave their supply chains exposed. Look here, the fuel depots at Corvus, the staging grounds at the Vora system. They are bypassing their own escort protocols to catch us." Reed looked up, a dark glint in his eye. "You noticed that too?" "If we hit Corvus," Hayes said, his mind moving faster, now detaching the medical morality from the cold, hard logistics of survival. "We don't just destroy their fuel. We strand the 7th Fleet in deep space. 400 ships sitting dead in the water with no life support." "That was my initial plan," Reed admitted. "But I need you to look at something else." The Admiral brought up a detailed anatomical breakdown of a Varakari soldier. Thick chitinous armor plates over redundant internal organs. They were built for physical trauma. "Arthur, you've stitched these bastards together for a decade. What happens to a Varakari if they suffer severe radiation? Burns not enough to kill. Just enough to poison the marrow." Hayes frowned, the clinical part of his brain engaging automatically. Their redundant organs go into overdrive to filter the blood. It causes massive system-wide inflammation. They require constant dialysis, intensive care, and a highly specialized, sterile environment for months. Otherwise, they die a very slow, very agonizing death. How much medical infrastructure does it take to support one irradiated Varakari soldier? A lot, Hayes said. 3 specialized nurses, constant chemical synthesis. It's a logistical nightmare. During the Aegis campaign, if a Varakari squad took radiation damage, they usually just euthanized them. It was cheaper than treating them. They euthanize their grunts, Reed corrected. But they don't euthanize their officers, and they don't euthanize their nobility. Reed changed the map, highlighting a massive, heavily shielded Varakari station orbiting a dead moon. This is the command hub for the 7th Fleet, Reed said. It's not a combat station, it's an administrative center, filled with high-ranking officers, tacticians, and the sons and daughters of the Varakari ruling class. Hayes felt a chill crawl up his spine. He realized what Reed was asking. "We aren't going to destroy the station," Reed said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "We are going to hit it with a dirty cobalt bomb. Low yield, maximum radiological spread." Hayes stared at the old man. "You want to irradiate the entire command staff, not kill them, poison them. If we kill them, they become martyrs," Reed stated cleanly, entirely devoid of emotion. "They get a state funeral, and the Empire builds statues. But if we irradiate 50,000 of their highest-ranking nobles, the Empire is forced to care for them. It will drain their medical supplies. It will tie up thousands of ships acting as hospital transports. It will bankrupt their supply lines. We don't just break their fleet, we break their economy. We force them to choke on their own wounded." It was a tactic so deeply cynical, so utterly devoid of the honor the galaxy claimed to fight with, that it left Hayes breathless. The alien empires fought to conquer. Humanity was going to fight to cripple. We were going to weaponize their own biology and societal structures against them. "Shoot to wound," Hayes whispered. "Exactly," Reed said. "It's math, Arthur. A dead soldier is a tragedy. A crippled soldier is a lifelong logistical burden." Hayes looked at the holographic breakdown of the alien biology. He thought of the Aurelian soldier who had died on his table 2 days ago. He thought of the thousands of refugees sucked into the vacuum of space. He had spent his life saving people. Now he was being asked to design a localized plague. He didn't hesitate. "If you use standard cobalt," Hayes said, his voice steady flat and unrecognizable to his own ears, "their armor plates will absorb 20% of the gamma radiation. You need to lace the warhead with a barium isotope. It will bond to their chitin and create secondary beta decay. They won't just be sick, they'll be radioactive. It will force them to quarantine their own command staff, causing mass panic across their fleet." Reed looked at him for a long, silent moment. The Admiral didn't smile, but he nodded slowly, a profound respect passing between the two men. "Plot the coordinates," Reed ordered the tactical deck. "Load the barium-laced warheads. We jump in 20. Humanity was no longer the galaxy's medic. We were the disease. And there was no cure. The command deck of the UNS Retribution was bathed in the sterile, pale glow of 100 holographic monitors. For a week, the ship had drifted in the dead space between star systems, acting as a ghost, a phantom listening post. Lieutenant Dawson, the chief communications officer, pulled off his heavy headset. He rubbed his eyes, which were bloodshot and ringed with deep purple exhaustion. Admiral Dawson called out, his voice hoarse. "You need to see this. The routing algorithms are going crazy." Admiral Reed walked over his heavy boots, clapping against the steel grating. Hayes followed closely behind. The former doctor had lost weight. The hollows of his cheeks were pronounced, giving him the look of a starving man though he ate his daily rations. It was a different kind of hunger. It was the slow, methodical digestion of his own conscience. Dawson brought up a sprawling map of the Varakari Empire. A week ago, it had been a solid web of secure military transit lanes. Now it looked like a hemorrhaging lung. The barium cobalt strike at their command hub worked, Dawson said, typing quickly to isolate specific comms traffic. It worked too well. Over 50,000 high-ranking Varakari were irradiated. Their chitin absorbed the barium just as Dr. Hayes predicted. They are actively poisoning anyone who gets near them without heavy lead lining. "Show me the logistics," Reed demanded. Dawson tapped a key. Hundreds of blue icons representing Varakari heavy cruisers and dreadnoughts suddenly vanished from the front lines where they had been fighting the Aurelian ascendancy. They reappeared deep inside Varakari territory, clustering around the irradiated command station. "They've pulled almost 30% of their active military assets off the front," Dawson explained. "They're using dreadnoughts as makeshift hospital ships. They don't have the medical transports to move 50,000 critically ill VIPs, so they're gutting their warships to make room. They are stripping life support from the lower decks just to power the quarantine fields." Hayes stared at the blinking blue lights. He knew exactly what was happening on those ships. The panic, the screaming, the smell of melting chitin and failing organs. He had spent his entire career fighting to stop that exact suffering. Now he was the architect of it. "It gets worse for them," Dawson continued. "The irradiated officers are demanding priority treatment. They are the nobility. They are ordering their physicians to redirect synthesized blood and dialysis machines from the regular infantry wards. The Varakari lower classes are bleeding out in the hallways, while the nobles commandeer entire wings. Intercepted civilian networks show massive riots breaking out on 3 of their core worlds. Their supply chains are entirely gridlocked." Reed didn't smile. He just watched the map with cold, clinical satisfaction. "A military is only as strong as its supply lines," Reed murmured. "They wanted to wage a war of attrition against our hospitals. We just turned their entire empire into a waiting room." A sharp, shrill alarm suddenly cut through the quiet hum of the bridge. The holographic map snapped from the Varakari territories to the borders of Sol space. A cluster of yellow icons flared to life just outside the orbit of Pluto. "Slipspace ruptures?" the tactical officer shouted from across the room. "Multiple signatures. They just crossed the Kuiper border." "Varakari retaliation?" Hayes asked, his pulse finally spiking. "No," Dawson said, his fingers flying across his console. "Signatures don't match. It's the Aurelian ascendancy. 5 heavy carrier groups. They're broadcasting on open channels." Dawson routed the audio through the bridge speakers. The Aurelian language was musical, a series of melodic chimes and low hums instantly translated by the ship's AI. "Human fleet. We are the spearhead of the Aurelian ascendancy. We have witnessed your strikes against the Varakari tyrants. We applaud your ferocity. We have entered your territory to formally offer an alliance. Together, we will divide the Varakari sectors between us. Lower your defense grids and receive our diplomats." Hayes felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The Aurelians were the empire that had glassed 3 human colonies 80 years ago during a border dispute. They had apologized, paid reparations, and the UN had accepted it in the name of peace. But the Sol Defense Initiative had a very long memory. The Aurelians hadn't come to make an alliance. They had come to scavenge. They saw the humans dismantling the Varakari, and they wanted a piece of the corpse. By jumping a massive fleet directly into human space, they were posturing, showing off their teeth under the guise of a smile. "They think we're their attack dogs," Hayes said quietly. Admiral Reed turned his back on the map. He walked slowly toward the primary command chair, his face entirely unreadable. Dawson, open a channel to the Aurelian flagship. Audio only. Channel open, Admiral. Reed leaned down toward the microphone. He didn't raise his voice. He spoke with the exhausted patience of a man swatting a wasp. Aurelian Fleet, this is Admiral Thomas Reed of the Soul Defense Initiative. You have entered restricted human space. We do not want your alliance. We do not want your diplomats. You have exactly 3 minutes to initiate your slip-space drives and return to your own borders. If a single one of your ships remains in this sector after that time, we will not target your fleet. Reed paused, letting the silence hang heavily over the open frequency. We will target your homeworld's orbital tethers. We will drop your sky cities into your oceans. You have 2 minutes and 40 seconds. Dawson muted the channel. On the map, the yellow icons sat motionless. The Aurelians were calling the bluff. They believed the human fleet was entirely tied up in Varakari space. They didn't realize the retribution was just one titan in a fleet that had been quietly building for 2 centuries. Admiral, the tactical officer reported. They are powering up their forward shielding. They aren't leaving. Shame, Reed said softly. Give the order to the Jupiter defense grid. Hayes watched the screen. Around the gas giant of Jupiter, deep within the churning storms of its atmosphere, massive hidden defense platforms woke up. They were orbital rail cannons too large to put on a ship powered directly by the kinetic energy of the planet's magnetic field. There was no grand space battle. There were no swirling dogfights or desperate maneuvers. 5 distinct lines of white-hot kinetic energy lashed out from Jupiter. They crossed the solar system in minutes. The solid mass slugs bypassed the Aurelian thermal shields as if they were made of tissue paper. The 5 lead Aurelian carriers were cored instantly. The sheer velocity of the impact caused the alien ships to implode, crumpling inward, before detonating into expanding clouds of frozen debris. The remaining Aurelian ships didn't wait. They didn't return fire. Panic seized their fleet as they realized the humans weren't fighting a war of conquest. They were operating a pest control service. Within 40 seconds, the surviving yellow icons vanished, jumping blindly back into slipspace. Reed looked at Hayes. We are not the Varakari's enemy, Arthur. We are the galaxy's boundary line, and the line is drawn. A month later, the galaxy had stopped burning. Not because peace had been brokered, but because the fuel had simply run out. The Varakari Empire, the great terror of the Orion Arm, was on the verge of total societal collapse. Their military was grounded, paralyzed by the sheer volume of irradiated officers draining their resources. Their shipyards were drifting fields of slag. Their economy had flatlined, as every available credit was routed to emergency medical supplies. They were suffocating under the weight of their own biology. The UNS Retribution hung in low orbit above Varakari Prime, the Empire's capital world. A fleet of 300 human warships surrounded the planet, entirely blacking out the sun for the northern hemisphere. They didn't bomb the cities. They didn't launch drop pods of Marines. They just sat there, a silent, terrifying sword hanging over 1 billion heads. Incoming transmission, Dawson called out, his voice tight. It's from the planetary palace. It's the Supreme Commander. Put him on the main screen, Reed ordered. The holographic display flickered. An alien face appeared. The Supreme Commander of the Varakari was a massive, imposing figure, his chitinous armor usually painted in brilliant reds and golds. Now the armor was dull, chipped. His mandibles twitched nervously. He looked exhausted. He looked broken. Human Admiral, the translation software hissed. You have dismantled our shipyards. You have poisoned our leadership. Our people starve while our medical ships run out of fuel. We concede. You have won the war. The Supreme Commander bowed his head, a gesture of profound humiliation in their culture. We offer unconditional surrender. We will cede the Aegis sector to humanity. We will provide 500 million tons of refined ore as tribute. We will sign treaties guaranteeing your borders. Name your terms." Admiral Reed stood perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back. Hayes stood beside him, watching the alien leader. Hayes felt no triumph. He felt only a hollow, scraping emptiness. "Supreme Commander," Reed said, his voice flat, "you misunderstand our presence here. We do not want the Aegis sector. We have no use for your ore. Our economy is entirely self-sustaining." The alien blinked his 4 eyes, narrowing in confusion. "Then what are your terms? What do you want?" "We want you to stop," Reed said simply. "You broke the Sol Concordat. You targeted our medical station. You murdered 14,000 pacifists because you thought our restraint was a weakness." Reed stepped closer to the camera. "We do not want your surrender, because a surrender implies that one day, when you have rebuilt, you might try again. We are not interested in repeating this conversation in 100 years. I do not understand," the Supreme Commander stammered. "If you do not want territory and you do not want resources, why are you here?" "To ensure you can never build a warship again," Reed stated. "Here are our terms. They are not negotiable. You will dismantle every orbital foundry in your empire. You will scuttle your remaining military vessels. You will restrict your planetary defense grids to basic anti-asteroid ballistics. If we detect the construction of a warp-capable military vessel anywhere in your territory, we will not bomb your shipyards." Reed pointed a finger at the screen, his eyes burning with a terrifying absolute certainty. "We will drop kinetic dust into the upper atmosphere of your agricultural worlds. We will block out your suns. We will let your crops freeze. And we will watch your empire starve to death in the dark. We will not fire a single shot. We will simply let nature erase you." The bridge of the retribution was dead silent. Even the hum of the cooling fans seemed to fade. It was a threat of such apocalyptic casual cruelty that the Varakari commander physically recoiled from the screen. That is madness," the alien whispered. "You would condemn billions to starvation. You are monsters." "We used to be doctors," Hayes said. It was the first time he had spoken during a diplomatic broadcast. He stepped up beside Reed. His voice was quiet, lacking the booming authority of the Admiral, but it carried a chilling clinical weight. "We spent 2 centuries fixing the bones you broke." Hayes continued, staring directly into the alien's eyes. "We wiped the blood off your soldiers so you could send them back out to kill. We tried to be the better angels of this galaxy. You burned our wings. So now you get the monsters." Hayes leaned in. "We know exactly how many calories a Varakari needs to survive. We know exactly how much sunlight your crops require. We have done the math. If you build a warship, we adjust the thermostat. Do you understand the diagnosis, Commander?" The alien stared at the human doctor, a profound primal terror dawning in his eyes. He realized he wasn't speaking to a conquering general. He was speaking to a planetary exterminator. We accept the terms." The commander breathed, the fight entirely drained from him. "The Varakari Empire disarms." "See that you do," Reed said. "Transmission cut." The screen went black. Reed exhaled slowly, the tension leaving his shoulders. He turned to look at the massive blue-green sphere of Varakari Prime through the viewport. "Did we mean it?" Hayes asked, quietly staring at the floor. "About the agricultural worlds? Would we actually starve them?" Reed looked at the younger man. The hard lines on the Admiral's face seemed to soften just for a fraction of a second, revealing the immense, crushing weight of the crown he wore. "Arthur," Reed said softly. The only way to stop a bully is to make him believe with absolute certainty that you are entirely willing to burn his house down with him inside it. Let's pray they never test the bluff. Hayes nodded slowly. He looked down at his hands. They were no longer the hands of a healer. They were the hands of a warden. Humanity hadn't saved the galaxy. We had just put it in a cage, and we had locked ourselves inside with it. 5 standard years passed. The galaxy did not burn. It held its breath. Aegis Prime. The dirtball world that had once been a slaughterhouse was quiet. The cratered landscape where Varakari dreadnoughts had systematically erased cities was now covered in a creeping, pale moss. Nature was reclaiming the glassed earth, indifferent to the politics of the dead. Arthur Hayes stood at the edge of a massive impact crater, the collar of his heavy grey trench coat turned up against the biting wind. He was no longer a doctor. He wasn't a captain either. His official title within the Soul Defense Initiative was Compliance Overseer. It was a sterile bureaucratic name for a planetary warden. A sleek, angular UN dropship idled 100 yards behind him. Its engines whined at a low, threatening pitch, a constant reminder of the sword hanging over the sky. The atmospheric scrubbers a fully operational overseer. Hayes turned. Standing a few feet away was an Aurelian civil engineer. The alien's posture was stiff, rigid, with an instinctual, trembling fear. It kept its 4 eyes fixed firmly on the muddy ground, refusing to look Hayes in the face. "Crop yields?" Hayes asked. His voice had lost the warm, reassuring cadence of a healer. It was flat. Utilitarian. "Up by 12%, the Aurelian stammered. "The new irrigation networks are functional. We have met our agricultural quotas. We are preparing the surplus shipments for the refugee colonies in the outer belt." "Good," Hayes said. "Maintain the output. If you run into localized blight, transmit a request to the Sol Logistics Hub. We will authorize chemical drops. Do not attempt to synthesize agricultural drones. Drone manufacturing violates the disarmament treaty." "We would never," the engineer said quickly, taking a half-step backward. "We understand the terms. We are compliant." Hayes looked at the alien. 5 years ago, on this exact planet, he had worked for 30 hours straight, trying to reconstruct the shattered spine of an Aurelian child while Varakari bombs shook the foundation of his triage tent. He had held their hands. He had wiped their blood from his visor. Now they looked at him, as if he were death itself. "You're doing well," Hayes offered softly, trying to inject a sliver of humanity into the exchange. "The rebuilding, it's impressive." The Aurelian didn't smile. It just offered a short, jerky bow. "We are permitted to live. We do not waste the permission." The alien scurried away, desperate to put distance between itself and the grey-clad human. Hayes turned back to the crater. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, battered metal tin. Inside were the charred remains of a UN medic badge. He had found it in the debris field of Sanctuary Station. He didn't know if it belonged to Jenkins or Cole or one of the 1,000 other kids who had burned in the dark. He just carried it. A piece of shrapnel embedded in his soul. Overseer Hayes. Captain Mitchell walked up the muddy incline, his boots crunching on the frost-covered moss. Mitchell was a younger man, part of the new generation of UN officers who had never worn the white uniform. He had only ever known the grey. "The Varakari perimeter reports are in," Mitchell said, handing Hayes a datapad. "Their orbital foundries are completely dismantled. They've converted their remaining heavy freighters into agricultural transports. No anomalous energy signatures in their deep space sectors. They are completely grounded. And the Keltesh swarms. They tried to test the border near Orion." Mitchell replied, a grim smirk playing on his lips. We dropped a tungsten rod into their primary breeding hive. Just one. They transmitted a formal apology 20 minutes later and retreated 6 parsecs. Hayes looked at the datapad. A spreadsheet of absolute, terrifying submission. The galaxy was at peace. A perfect, unbroken, bloodless peace. Because humanity had put a gun to the back of the galaxy's head and cocked the hammer. "It's working," Mitchell said, looking out over the quiet valley. "My grandfather fought in the Orion skirmishes. He said the alien empires would never stop bleeding each other. But we did it. We broke the wheel." "We didn't break the wheel, Captain," Hayes said quietly, handing the pad back. "We just became the axle. We are the only thing keeping it from turning." Mitchell frowned. "We saved billions of lives, sir. The war is over. That's what matters." "Is it?" Hayes asked. He looked up at the sky. Through the thin grey clouds, the faint, glinting silhouette of a UN Class 5 Titan sat in high orbit. A silent sentry. "Mothers on Aurelia don't tell their children stories about monsters hiding in the dark anymore, Mitchell. They tell them to behave, or the humans will come down from the sky. Better feared and alive than loved and dead." Mitchell quoted, "Standard SDI doctrine." "Maybe," Hayes murmured. He started walking back toward the dropship. "Let's go home. The silence here is giving me a headache." They flew back to the Retribution in silence. Hayes watched the curvature of Aegis Prime fall away through the viewport. He remembered a time when human ships were greeted with cheers, with tears of desperate relief. Now human ships were greeted with the frantic, terrified silence of a rabbit, seeing the shadow of a hawk. We traded our halos for iron crowns, and the iron was heavy. Geneva was raining. A cold, relentless drizzle washed over the cobblestones of the plaza outside the United Nations Defense Council. The memorial was simple. It wasn't a towering statue of a heroic soldier or a grand winged angel of victory. It was a massive, perfectly smooth slab of black obsidian stretching for 100 yards along the plaza. Carved into the stone in stark white lettering were 14,281 names. The victims of Sanctuary Station. Arthur Hayes stood before the wall. The rain soaked through his hair, running down his face like cold tears. He found the section he was looking for. Cole David, First Officer. Jenkins Sarah, Chief Surgeon. Miller Gregory, Station Director. He reached out his fingers, tracing the engraved letters of Sarah's name. The stone was freezing. It never gets easier to look at. Hayes didn't turn around. He recognized the rasping, oxygen-starved voice. Admiral Thomas Reed rolled his wheelchair closer to the wall. The old man was dying, his lungs heavily scarred from a lifetime of breathing recycled starship air, and cheap cigars were finally giving out. He had a clear oxygen tube wrapped around his face, and he looked impossibly fragile. The terror of the Varakari Empire was just a broken old man in a chair. "You shouldn't be out in the rain, Tom," Hayes said softly. "My doctors tell me I shouldn't eat salt either," Reed wheezed. "I ignore them too, the perks of outranking everyone on the planet." Hayes finally turned. He looked down at the man who had ordered the poisoning of an entire alien nobility, the man who had threatened to starve billions. "I submitted my resignation this morning," Hayes said. Reed didn't look surprised. He just stared at the black wall. "I thought you might. 5 years is a long time to play the executioner, Arthur. I can't look at them anymore," Hayes admitted, his voice cracking. The iron restraint he had held for 5 years finally began to fracture. "I can't look at the aliens when I do my inspections. I look into their eyes and I don't see enemies. I see patients. I see the people I used to save, and they look at me like I'm a demon." "You are a demon," Reed said firmly. "We all are. That was the price. Reed engaged the motor on his chair, moving closer to Hayes. He reached out with a trembling, liver-spotted hand and gripped Hayes's wrist. The old man's grip was surprisingly strong. "Look at this wall, Arthur," Reed commanded. "Look at the names." Hayes looked. "For 200 years we were the best of them," Reed said, his voice dropping into a fierce, ragged whisper. "We were the angels. We took their broken, their burned, their dying, and we healed them. And what did it get us? It got us a slaughterhouse. It got us a target painted on our backs because the galaxy mistook grace for weakness." Reed let go of Hayes's wrist and leaned back, gasping slightly for air. "The universe doesn't respect angels, Arthur. It eats them. The only thing the void respects is a bigger teeth and a darker shadow." "So we became the darkness," Hayes said bitterly. "Yes," Reed agreed. "We took on the sin so they wouldn't have to. We locked the galaxy in a cage to stop them from killing each other. And we threw away the key." "Who watches us, Tom?" Hayes asked. "If we're the wardens who keeps us in check, what happens in 50 years when the next generation of humans grows up, knowing nothing but absolute power? When they start thinking of the aliens not as burdens to manage, but as subjects to rule?" Reed looked away. For the first time since Hayes had known him, the Admiral looked uncertain. "I don't know," Reed admitted softly. "I won't be here to see it. I bought us peace. I bought an end to the orbital bombardments, an end to the planetary glassings. The future, that is a problem for the men who come after me. It's a poisoned chalice." "It is," Reed said. He looked back up at the names carved in the stone. "But look up there. Aegis Prime hasn't had a single civilian casualty in 5 years. The Aurelian children are growing up with intact spines. The Keltesh haven't burned a border colony since we shattered their hive. It's an ugly, terrifying peace. But it is peace." Hayes stepped back from the wall. The rain was falling harder now, washing the obsidian clean, making the white names glow brightly in the gloom. He thought of the Varakari commander begging for his people. He thought of the Aurelian engineer trembling in the mud. He thought of the sheer, quiet terror that now blanketed the stars. We didn't bring enlightenment to the galaxy. We brought a leash. "Goodbye, Tom," Hayes said quietly. "Where will you go?" Reed asked. "You can't go back to medicine. The Galactic Medical Board was disbanded. Nobody wants a human doctor anymore." "I know," Hayes said. "I'm going to the outer colonies, where it's quiet. I'm going to try and forget the math." The math, the exact calculation of how many calories a species needed to survive. The exact yield of a cobalt bomb required to cripple a medical infrastructure. Hayes turned up his collar and walked away, leaving the old Admiral alone with his ghosts. High above the rain clouds beyond the atmosphere, the UNS Retribution hung in the dark. It was a massive, brutal slab of grey metal. It carried no red cross. It broadcast no message of hope. It simply waited. Humanity had stayed out of the galactic wars. We had tried to be the medics. But when the galaxy pushed us, they learned a terrible truth. The greatest monsters aren't born in the dark. They are forged when you extinguish the light of a good man. The galaxy was finally safe, and they would never, ever sleep soundly again. If this story made you feel the cold weight of the void, hit that like button to show your support. Humanity's shift from galactic healers to terrifying wardens is a dark mirror to the classic HFY trope. Sometimes the price of peace is our own soul. What did you think of Admiral Reed's brutal calculus? Was he right, or did humanity become the very villains they sought to stop? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Don't forget to share this tale with fellow sci-fi fans, and subscribe for more deeply grounded emotional galactic stories. See you out there in the dark.